I have some questions, but I wanted to give you a chance, because you've been busy interviewing, to share with your audience, with our whole MS Now audience, any of your top line or first takeaways. And then I have a question for you as well.
Well, I'm just so struck by how decency and integrity and facts and apolitical sort of careers don't screech, right? And so much of what we're oriented to cover is that which is shrieking, right? They're shrieking by arresting tourists at the reflecting pool, or shrieking by diverting intelligence agents from the FBI to some crackpot case in Georgia, or shrieking because someone is covered concerning conduct by the director of the FBI. And instead, like, what integrity sounds like is something a lot more methodical and calm and by the book. And I think that when we get to meet the people that we've covered, I was deathly nervous. I reread every piece of paper we ever had. But the thing about public servants is, like, there's not some, you know, they don't hide the secret side. It's not a diversion. And I thought about how much Trump has sort of broken my brain. You know, I'm sitting here trying to figure out what he hid and what he didn't tell us. And a lot of what we talked about were the kinds of things that you and I covered from the filings and the things that were public facing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I have a couple questions. The first was thinking about who we're listening to. And as I mentioned, he obviously trusts you and thinks of you as someone that he can have a factual dialogue with about the health of our civic life and our democracy and our rule of law. And again, I think that's striking. And it's not a surprise to those of us who work with you, but it bears noting, even if we are also colleagues. And in doing that, he was issuing, yeah, sure. He was issuing the warning. I mean, if Bob Mueller was the Elliot Ness of his time, Jack Smith is the Bob Mueller of our time. And he had nothing but, you know, kind words of respect for how Mueller lived his life and career and integrity. And so when we listen to what I'm calling the Mueller of our time today, Bob Mueller has passed, and he tells you tonight that we are facing this attack on the rule of law that is different. That this is not, sometimes there are crimes and sometimes there are people in office who have been caught committing crimes in both parties, as he was careful to note. But this is something different. We have just that short bit. I don't know if it jumped out to you in the moment, but let's listen to that for your response.
I think we are facing an attack on the rule of law that is different in kind and scope to anything I've seen in my lifetime.
What does that mean to you, that he wants us to know that?
Well, look, in some ways, there's so much gaslighting in our politics. And there's so much sort of a attempt to intimidate people covering the facts as we see them with our own eyes, that it was reassuring that he sees what we see and what we cover, and that from his extraordinarily high perch inside the department and with all of his years of experience, he views it as dire as I do. It was, I would say, equally striking that when I asked him, you know, if you were looking at our country and just assessing it in terms of whether the rule of law were alive or dead, is it still alive? He said, absolutely. I mean, that he knows of sort of more pockets, I guess, the things that aren't in the headlines inside the department that are still, and he said, you know, they're not throwing sand in the gear. They're not part of the resistance. They're just in there doing their job. But then he did say, I said, but what if doing their job, you know, ran afoul of Mr. Blanche or others? And he said, yeah, well, that would be the fork in the road. I mean, what was interesting to me is that it is both as bad as it looks from the outside, that weaponization is the central organizational theory for the Department of Justice, that the examples that he lifted up were Danielle Sassoon, that's who he was talking about there at the end, who left over the perfectly predicated case against Eric Adams, the folks who have, you know, left before bringing the cases against Jim Comey, Eric Siebert, and others, the people in Minnesota he mentioned who refused to investigate family members of a shooting victim. What is, I think, still... I think the work for people like us is to do what he's talking about, to lift up the people who are sort of paying the price of their life's work, of people who grow up and want to do this work are some of the very ones who rose to the top. And those ones at the top were the ones that worked on his cases. So I think I had a greater appreciation for the loss of experience, the loss of the cream of the crop, right? The people that have been purged were not necessarily the first agents in. They were the best of the best, the ones who understood the sensitive nature of the cases against Donald Trump, the ones who had enough clearances to even work on the Mar-a-Lago documents case. He couldn't say anything about that one, and didn't bite when I asked him if he thought Aileen Cannon would be nominated to the Supreme Court. But I think it was both reassuring that he sees the direness of the moment, the way you and I think largely cover it. And it was ominous to think about all the experience that's been axed for political purpose from the Bureau and the department.
Yeah, and when you take out the experts, the tough people, the folks with multi-decade experience in catching the bad folks, then wholly separate from the rule of law issues, which we care so much about, you also make the country less safe, quite literally so. I have one more question for you, then I'll let you go. I'm kind of Lawrencing your Rachel right now.
We can do this anytime. I'm always available.
You know, in lyrics, the famous lyric is, "Please, Lord, don't let me be misunderstood." And I felt through him, and I'm curious your take, that like Mueller before him and like folks who were using the integrity, quiet rule book, and we understand why in normal times that has been the norm, that he referred back repeatedly, even when it wasn't in your question, to communicating, to reaching people with the facts, and making people understand these cases. And I wonder, because you were a communicator in your own right, and here we are in media, so that's part of what we do is look at the stories, define them, try to tell them. What it says about, you said broke your brain, well, whether a reality show propagandist has broke some of the communication and storytelling in our country, where my view, and I'm curious yours, I think he's basically right in his theory of the case, that if you don't communicate in real time with the way people are getting information on their phones, et cetera, today, you're at a disadvantage. And yet
Absolutely.
I also thought it's too bad that people doing the substantive work, not to diminish the communication we all do, but the people doing substantive work, like I don't want my doctor or my beat cop prosecutor thinking too much about the press release when they need to do the job. I give you the final word on that tonight.
So I thought about Tim Snyder when we had this part of the conversation, who, you know, wrote on tyranny, writes about autocracy. And I thought about how you don't need to overwhelm people by making everyone think that we all have to do everything, right? We all have to do our thing. And what I thought was interesting is he has what every veteran of the Department of Justice has for Robert Mueller, and that's reverence, full stop. And he's making some different choices. So he didn't say that he learned, and he said to me it wasn't on my mind at all. It is also true that in one news cycle, Donald Trump and Bill Barr destroyed 23 months of Robert Mueller's meticulous, respectful deference to the prerogatives of Donald Trump when he was interviewing him. And Jack Smith has made a lot of the same choices, but a few different choices. And I think that's really interesting in its own right.